Today is September the 14th and there's tons of stuff going on in the world, the Apple Live event, and now Canon just released the Canon EOS R3. I am more and more excited about what the future holds in terms of cameras, and especially using the Canon EOS R for a couple of years. I do have dreams about upgrading at some point, but Canon was lacking in certain areas for the last releases essentially, and now with the R3 it is getting really exciting. Now in this video I want to talk about what the R3 has to offer. However, I do not have it in my hands. I can only get by the information that I find on the internet that was just released and is also released by people who have early preview or pre-production models that have made videos about it, and all of those were kind of dropped today. And I looked at some of that information, and to be honest, at the first moment I thought, that's not really the camera that I would want to use. But then I actually took a second look, and I would say if I had the money, I would definitely go for it right this second, just simply because it right now in this moment is the most promising Canon camera that I have seen so far. Now, of course, as of right now, in the area of mirrorless cameras, Canon has the EOS R, the RP, which is the smaller brother to this one. Then we have the R6 in the lineup, the R5, now the R3, and then they also released the C70 for video purposes. Now I want to quickly mention what my issue right now is with this whole lineup, or especially with the previous lineup, and that is that up to this point, except for the C70, which is a cinema camera which is focused on video making, all of the Canon cameras, the RP, the R, the R5, and the R6, all of them have the 30-minute record time limit. Now what I am kind of envisioning as a potential future wish list camera, that would be, for me, the next step to go and be able to shoot 4K without a record time limit. Now, the people who have Sony cameras or looking at buying a Sony camera, those will probably say, hey, come over to our boat, we have that and we have had that for years at this point. Why are you even bothering with Canon? And to that, I just have to say, I love the glass. I just invested in more of it. And I also really like the form factor of Canon cameras, the feel, the software. A lot of things about that are simply what I enjoy more in comparison to what Sony has to offer at the moment. And I was using Sony for the better part of 2 or 3 years. Now one might say, why not go for the C70 then? That does not have the 30-minute record time limit. However, that also is plagued by the crop factor when you use RF glass, because it is a Super 35 sensor, and that means crop for just about all of the RF lenses. Now, if you do have a full set of EF lenses, then you can get yourself an adapter with a little bit of a lens in there, and then your C70 becomes a full frame sensor camera for those EF camera lenses. Then, however, you have that whole thing still that with the new RF lenses, those are crop factored on the C70, which again is not what I would prefer to work with. I get that point with the C70 and why they went that route, and especially why they also have that speed booster that makes previous EF lenses full frame, because they also have that whole cinema lineup of lenses, which are manual lenses. Those also become full frame lenses on the C70 with said adapter, so it makes a lot of sense. However, again, for someone who wants to travel with those new RF lenses and you want to actually be able to use and utilize those to the fullest extent, you will not get that with the C70, at least not in full frame. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video with the EOS R still being a good camera in 2021, I want to have a full frame camera and I want to be able to shoot full frame, which is one of the reasons why I don't like the 4K crop on this camera. Now, of course, one of the options would be to go simply for one of the R6 or R5 cameras. However, let's be honest, I did choose to go for the ATOMOS Ninja recorder, and that was my solution for a long time. Then I don't have the money to simply just go out and buy 2 R5 cameras or R6 cameras for that matter, because after all, they also cost over $2,000 each. And it only would give me the 4K, still leaving me with that damn pesky 30-minute record time limit, which I don't want to deal with at all anymore. If I choose to upgrade my camera, I might as well upgrade to something that actually gives me 2 or more of those aspects. So my current wish list would be full frame, RF mount, 4K, no crop, and no 30-minute record time limit, and that 4K with at least 60 frames per second, if not 120 frames per second. And now enter the R3. Canon actually announced this camera months ago. However, today, the 14th at 1200 CST, something like that, Central European time, they actually made their announcement. They had the whole release show that they published on YouTube and streamed there. And now we actually have the first real information about the specifications and all of that. Now, a couple things here as we go through this and as I look at this. Personally, I am not a sports or news shooter, so this camera still has certain aspects to it which are not really that exciting to me. And I would choose to basically push those out of the way and make room for other more important features for myself. However, that's always kind of the balancing act, I would say. One person wants more photography features, and then you have video shooters who want to focus all their energy on that. So Canon really has a tough time making the perfect camera for any of these groups because obviously they can only pack so many features into a camera. And we've seen how that turns out when they make a photography-centered camera, which is the R5. However, they also pack the 8K with the whole overheating issue and all of that. Now here, in this case, based on the information that we have and also based on the information that people have already tested with pre-production models, this camera does not overheat, at least not in the same way as the R5 does. However, it also does not shoot 8K and it also does not oversample the 4K from a 45 megapixel sensor. And that, by the way, is the first drawback that I saw when I heard about the main announcement, and that is that they put a 24 megapixel sensor in here. Now, right now, I am used to a about 30 megapixel sensor here in the Canon EOS R, and I can't really say that I would need more. I have a really hard time imagining needing more in that sense. And I also am realizing how big files are getting when you have a 30 megapixel camera, and I can't even start to imagine how that looks when you have a 45 megapixel Canon EOS R5. And as of right now, I'm working with a 2017 MacBook Pro, which is actually also struggling with video files in 4K if I shoot them on this camera. So I'm not necessarily ready to make all of the upgrades yet, which is also one of the reasons why I am kind of trying to upgrade everything at a certain time point. Right now, investing into lenses and working with those, then investing into a new computer when Apple finally decides to drop the M1X or whatever they are going to call that, the MacBook Pro with the M1 chip, hopefully being able to render and work with 4K files no problem whatsoever. So that's really going to be exciting. And from that point forward, also working toward being able to work with those bigger files, being able to work with 4K footage and the storage needs for that, being able to render it ideally in mostly real time, and then also upgrading cameras to be able to shoot in that range as well. Now, the same thing goes for photos and the megapixel count there, because my library in Lightroom, let's say I'm currently struggling sometimes, and you can always, or you will always need more power to handle bigger files and to make your adjustments there and have snappy transitions between those photos so that you can swift through them quickly, edit them through, and do that all very easily. So my first reaction at the 24 megapixels was, well, I would rather wait for something that has a little bit more to offer than that. So I was a little bit underwhelmed. However, I understand it from the standpoint of who this camera is actually made for, in the sense of being made for someone with a news background or sports. Because there you get 24 megapixels, which is plenty for all of the use cases for news or also for the use cases of sports photography. But then you have a burst rate of 30 frames per second, which essentially means that you can render a fucking video out of that frame rate, which is kind of insane. And now, of course, it's the shooting with, I think, the electronic shutter, and that may or may not give you other results than shooting with a mechanical shutter, but it is pretty insane. Now then you also have the inbuilt stabilization, which already was something that we had in the R5 and R6. So that's going to be put over there, which is incredible and helping so much. And I'm just looking forward to get that. Now, right now with the Canon EOS R, I have the built-in digital stabilization, which is not a real comparison because this is going to give you more of a cropped in image, let's say that. So this camera is the master of cropping just about everything that you do with it. So that is an option here. You have the eye control autofocus, which is going to be really interesting, and how that's going to be implemented. And also, if they bring that over to other cameras, I would absolutely love to see that in almost all of the other cameras, because I think that it could make things really, really easy instead of having to touch on the monitor or stuff like that. So that's going to be really cool. The subject tracking getting better. That's just a matter of software increasing and the CPU power. So that's really interesting and cool. But I think the more interesting stuff is then going down here, 6K RAW, 4K, 120 frames per second. And we'll talk about that in just about a moment. However, I want to first go into how this camera actually looks. And of course, it is a camera that looks more like the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II, which a ton of YouTubers were using for vlogging. For example, Peter McKinnon, Sawyer Hartman, Lust LeBlanc, all of those people were using the 1DX Mark III or II at some point in their career. And that's the form factor that is back here with the double grip, so that you can actually work with this in vertical format or in portrait format for doing video or photography. And I think nowadays that is actually more important than ever in a certain way, because we have more and more the need for vertical video and also for vertical photography, especially, for example, for Instagram or the likes. So I'm really glad that they bring this form factor back, and I'm really excited to, at some point, hold a camera like this in my hands. Now, you can get the same effect here with a battery grip slipped on top of the bottom, and there's an original one, and of course you also have the third-party ones, and that is, of course, an option. But it's something different when the camera just has that form factor without any seams in between, without any screw that you have to put into the tripod screw at the bottom. Nothing like that. This is just built in, and I'm really excited to see a form factor like this again. However, it brings the problem of weight back, because of course you have a bigger battery and you have more body in general for this camera. And I have read, I think that this is basically a 1 kilogram camera with battery and the storage put into the camera. So it's a kilo, and of course a camera like this will never reach that kind of weight without putting a lens on it. However, it's maybe something that I would be willing to take onto my travels if that were the only downside. Really interesting look up here. There's a monitor at the top right there, and then you have a couple of interesting buttons here on the left-hand side, which is a good indicator, because I absolutely dislike the power on off button here on the left-hand side of the camera, because it always means I have to use 2 hands with this camera to turn it on and off. So that's a real improvement when they are moving this back to a different place. And from what I see based on these pictures, you can see now we have the on-off button, or switch rather, at the bottom right here. You have a joystick right there next to it, which is the same thing as it is top here, because of course you want to have the same button layout when you are in vertical shooting mode versus when you are in normal landscape shooting mode. Then we have the switch between video and photo mode with this little switch right there, and a record button right in the middle as well. And I think that also is a huge improvement over the way that the Canon EOS R handles this with the mode info mode button situation. I think that was kind of like a mistake that someone approved. I don't know why. Then we also have the AF on button, which this is tracking, and I haven't used it, but I hear that it is a great feature. And of course, we have the swivel tilt screen with the ability to actually see yourself when you're using this for vlogging. However crazy that may be, because it is, after all, an extremely expensive camera, I would absolutely use it for that purpose with the 15-35 lens. I think that that would be a pretty incredible setup, and I can't wait for a moment where there is place in my life where I can actually afford something like this to play around, but at the same time also use it to produce the content that I want to be making, and giving me the ability to just use everything that is possible, essentially. Which brings me over to the specifications. Now, one thing that I find important to mention here is that the photography side of things here is something that I feel like is almost negligible in terms of the talking points, at least from my perspective, because pretty much everything is going to be good enough. The 30 frames per second are incredible and just crazy. I hope they have a mode in there that you can actually slow it down, because I think that with 30 frames per second, you just overdo it 90% of the time, and you basically just want that if you actually need it. The other thing is the eye tracking autofocus. Of course, I can't really comment much about that, but I will have some links in the description below from people that have published some review or preview videos about this camera, and they talk about that feature specifically as being completely mind-blowing, essentially, and something that changes the game completely, and I'm really excited to see it, as I've mentioned before. But overall, the photography thing is that things just get a little bit better there, and I don't feel like there's much to talk about. Maybe I just don't take enough photos, and I'm not as much a, I don't know, pixel peeker on that front. But for me, the video capabilities of these cameras has been much more interesting, because from my point of view, you can take amazing photos with just about any of these cameras. But on the video front, we have that distinction, for example, for the things like, oh, this camera does 4K, but only with a crop, or this does 120 frames per second, but only with a crop, and all of the other things work, or stuff like that. With video, we see overheating, we see crop factors, and those kind of limitations. With photography, we don't see that as much. There's less stuff to talk about. Now, taking a look here at the EOS movie modes with the Canon EOS R3, that's the point where I actually got a little bit more excited, to be honest. After a little moment of thinking, well, 24 megapixels, I think that I would rather, if I had the chance, would wait it out and wait for whatever camera comes next that also features a little bit more of a megapixel count. However, looking at this, you can see you have a MP4 videos, and in MP4 format, you can film in 4K DCI as well as UHD. You can, of course, also do 6K in RAW. Now, in these other modes, you have more options in terms of the 4K and Full HD and those kind of things. You have 4K DCI, which is the cinema style. You have 60 frames per second, which interestingly features the same thing with the 6K RAW. And that actually is an interesting comparison between this R3 and the R5, because the R5, of course, only has 30 frames per second in 8K. It is 8K after all, but this camera here can do 60 frames per second in RAW with 6K. And I think that's pretty much double the pixels that 4K provides, whereas 8K would provide 4 times the amount of pixels that 4K provides, but 6K gives you almost double or more than double the pixels that 4K gives you, but it still does it at 60 frames per second and in RAW. And that is something that I find absolutely mind-blowing. Now, the file sizes will also be absolutely mind-blowing in that frame rate and in that format, but it gives you so much room to play with if you have the right use for that kind of footage. Now, in 4K, again, in DCI and in UHD, you have in both cases, or not in both cases, you have in DCI, you have 60 frames per second, 30, 24, 25, and 23.98. And then in 4K UHD, you also have the 120 frames per second. However, that is without sound. But then if you go down to 60 frames per second, you get sound back again. Full HD, you also have 120 frames per second, and you can go all the way down to, of course, 24 frames per second. I'm absolutely excited that they have made 120 frames per second something that is possible in 4K. They have the 60 frames per second with 6K in RAW. Pretty amazing stuff. And if you can handle that file size stuff, I think that that's going to be a game changer. And now we have the 30 limit, record time limit, which now finally doesn't exist anymore. Canon has been plagued by this since the start. When I started using the 5D Mark II, now right up to the Canon EOS R, the R6, the R5, all of them still have that, and other camera manufacturers had that as well. However, they switched that a couple of years ago and have no record time limit for a relatively long time. So Canon has been a little bit late to the game with this. However, now they actually have a 6-hour record time limit. And the interesting thing here is that I have seen someone, Gordon Lang, he actually tested this in one of the videos he published about this, and he actually got those 6 hours and then it stopped recording. And for me, that's absolutely enough and all I ever wanted, because I just want to be able to interview someone for over half an hour or an hour, maybe 2 hours is like, that's the area where I'm like, okay, fine, just make that record time limit if you have to. But half an hour is just over so quick, especially if you are doing like I am doing here with the multiple takes in a video, or when I'm working with someone and do an interview or something like that where I just want to get through it. I don't want to also keep an eye on all of the cameras that are currently running, that those are still recording. I just don't want to bother with it. And that is finally a thing of the past with this. And I just do hope that Canon will continue this forward and do the same thing for all of the other cameras that are now coming out from here on out. So for example, a future Canon EOS R Mark II, for example, that also would not include a 30 or 60 minute record time limit, so that just is a thing of the past. Let's just bury it and don't worry about it ever again. So finally, we have that in here, no more record time limit. So that's just a huge aspect now. Now going down further, we have the bit rates, and of course there we have a couple of very crazy ones when talking about the Canon RAW with the 6K. Now, if you, however, look at the 24 frames per second in 6K C RAW, then you're actually down to 720 megabits per second. And then if you look down to 4K DCI or UHD with 24 frames per second in all I, you also have 470 megabits per second. And all things considered, 720 is more, but it's not that much more than 470. It's not quite double, but you also get double the frame or double the pixel amount. So I think that is actually quite remarkable that you will get a 6K RAW file so that you can actually work with it, and you can also work with the ISO and white balance and those kind of things in the post-processing. And so that opens a whole lot of ideas and doors, for example, for travel, cinematography, and filmmaking. So that would be really exciting. Of course, if you want to shoot the 60 frames per second here, that's a really massive files, and you would really have to consider what you shoot, for how long you shoot, and what kind of space you want to be using on whatever medium you have inside of your camera. Now then, if you go down the list, you have 4K at 120 frames per second with 1880. So that's also already getting into the area where it's pretty massive. And if you're used to anything from the Canon EOS R5 or you've seen those sizes, those are just very similar. And that is something that I always say you really have to get used to, being able to afford the storage and the hard drives and basically spend a couple of $100s every time you put up a new project, because you're going to have a couple of terabytes of footage essentially. With a project like this, you're just gonna run through space that quick. And it is one of the main reasons why, as of right now, I am not yet fully invested in a 4K workflow, because you have to have the computer to handle it, and you have to have the storage to also be able to just put it somewhere. And so we are planning to produce our whole project in October in Spain. We are planning to do that in 4K where it makes sense, because it is a future proving of what we are doing. But at the same time, we had to purchase new hard drives just for that trip to be able to actually get all of that footage home. And we also purchased it double because, of course, you can't really rely on those disks. So if one gets lost or trashed or destroyed or maybe just magnetically somehow corrupted or whatever, we want to be safe that we have all of that. So 2 hard drives it is, and we brought those, or we will bring those to that trip. And now with file sizes like these, we would have to bring even bigger hard drive and maybe even more hard drives. So that's always a big consideration when you are working with this type of stuff here. And yeah, it's exciting that it's possible, and to be able to shoot 4K in C-RAW even down to 720 megabits per second. But then the 60 frames per second here, it's just amazing or incredible what you can get. At the same time, it is incredible what you will have to be able to handle all of this. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how this camera fares with the external recording with, for example, something like the ATOMOS Ninja V. However, I want to be able to not need a ATOMOS Ninja V, and that is actually one of the main reasons why I am so crossing my fingers that Canon will keep that record time limit out of the game, because I think that the ATOMOS is one of the main reasons for this, is to be able to bypass the record time limit. At least for me, it was when I invested into this piece of gear. And then, of course, you also have that aspect of being able to record ProRes. However, when I'm on location somewhere, I don't want to worry about, for example, needing an additional charger or don't want to need an additional batteries that can die on me when I am doing my recording. So the ATOMOS is a great device. It's amazing to be able to just shoot 4K, shoot onto the hard drives or the SSDs, and then just be able to basically transfer it with hyperspeed, work with the files immediately. ProRes on computers like the MacBook Pro, it's easy to work with even in 4K, and the ProRes RAW is supposed to be actually amazing as well. I haven't had a chance to shoot that, but it would be obviously amazing to just have ProRes RAW inside of the Canon EOS R3 or any Canon EOS camera. But at the moment, that's just not going to happen. But for the fact that you can just shoot all of these things internally, don't have to worry about bringing an external recorder, don't have to worry about extra batteries, all of those things, I think that that's a huge step forward for Canon to be able to put this into this body. Now, if you couldn't already tell, I would be absolutely stunned and excited to own even just one of these cameras. My personal ideal would be 3 of them, but that's maybe stretching it a little bit and putting it up into the future to at some point be in a place where I can actually do that. But for the projects that I have in mind, to be able to shoot a interview in a 2-person or even 3-people setup with 3 cameras, where it's like one wide angle lens to cover both people and then one camera for each of the individual people that are in the room, that would be my personal wish list right now. To have 3 of these cameras, I already have the lenses for them, so I would be able to work with that. But being able to use these for podcast productions on location and just bring my equipment there, film whoever is in the room and be able to produce high quality podcast-like interviews and then feature some more cinematic work around that, that would be some kind of an ideal. Maybe I am working toward some type of a documentary filming situation or something like that. So that would be my personal wish list. If I were to rank the cameras right now in terms of the order in which I would personally want them, it's basically the price, because the R3 is the top of the list right now. I would absolutely love to have this camera, and I would absolutely love to have this instead of any of the other current cameras, instead of the C70, instead of the R5 or R6, and of course also the R. I personally think the R is still a great starting point. 1080p is still great footage. I am working with it as of right now. I am not going to edit everything in 4K because I just can't handle all of these different aspects of it, as I have mentioned before. But it is great. Now, from that point, if the cash allows, the R6 is becoming more and more interesting. And as I reconsider my approach of what I would need in a camera, the R6 would have been a really interesting upgrade at a certain time if the financials would have allowed for it. But again, it still has the 30-minute record time limit, which makes it so that if you want to shoot interviews, you need either have your eye on it or shoot on something like the ATOMOS Ninja V, which records your footage without that limit. But then again, you have an additional investment of like $1,000 per camera that you want to record, and also have to worry about the batteries of that or bring power cords and all of those aspects. Then we have the R5, because it has all of the video features and even crazier than the R3, but it has the overheating, so that's why it is down the list. And the R3 now finally is the camera that would basically do it all as of right now. The megapixel count in my taste could be a little bit higher, and I'm really curious to see what Canon will bring out in that area to go a little bit higher in the same body factor. Like, that would be my personal choice, is in that body factor of the R3, of the 1DX style, to have a camera that has a higher megapixel count, like 50 maybe, or something like that, and then still have the same video capabilities, to have the flip out screen, the 4K oversampled with 120 frames per second and no overheating, and ideally also no 30 limit record time limit. That would be the ideal package in my personal taste. And maybe if Canon releases something like that before I can make that kind of investment, I would choose that over this. But as of right now, the R3 would be a camera that I would pick up hands down in a breath of an air if I were in a situation to upgrade to this camera. And now with that said and my opinion shared, I would appreciate to hear your story in the comment section down below, your opinion about the Canon EOS R lineup, the R3 specifically. Would you like to get one? Do you dream about getting one? Do you actually get one? Because it is part of your business to invest into this kind of equipment. Let me know in the comment section down below, and I would appreciate to also get a thumbs up if you found this entertaining, helpful, or any way interesting. Now with all that said, I think I'm gonna just save a little more, do a couple more projects, and hopefully upgrade to this camera sometime in the future. Have an amazing day, make it your life, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.